Other people more recently are talking about the photonic action is something that's tying into 2012. And I cover that in the DVD because it's very interesting. I'm not wholly a believer in it, but I present the information because it's very intriguing, this thing. That they're saying, yes, and in a very long cycle, in one of the great orbits that we have, of about 23,000 years, for 2,000 years, and it happens twice, the whole of our solar system passes through a belt of photonic action. Now, photons are the highest form of light that we know. And we'll talk about photons a little bit later in the connection to consciousness again. And they say that that is like a spring clean time. And we better be prepared because we may be heading for another one of those. That's intriguing. And that, wait a minute, we're not only having civilizations which rise and fall, but we also have that they go through cleansing cycles. Whole solar systems can go through cleansing cycles. But then the philosophers have always said it. Plato, Vico, they've all contemplated. Oswald Spengler, all the historians know or have philosophized or theorized that there is this cycle of time. The chaos, theocracy, aristocracy, democracy. The Brahmins often talk about the god Brahma, who is the ruler of the creation, the Atman. And they say that one of these enormous cycles, like their most lengthy cycle of billions and billions of years, they say is like a blinking of the eye of Brahma. It's nothing more than a day and a night in the life of the creator God. That's how they figure it. But of course, you can't talk about 2012 without the whole idea of prophecy and prediction. If you, in fact, buy into the idea that it was a prediction in the first place. The Maya talking about that at a certain date, around 1999, that will be the beginning of a 13-year countdown to the year 2012. And they said that is when history is going to end. That sounds like a prediction. I look at it as no more of a prediction than a master chef who's preparing a dinner and then he tells you what it's going to be. He knows he's making a souffle. There's no more prediction than that. If you know the meal that's going to be prepared, it's not really a prediction in the hard sense when you say this is going to be the outcome and this will be the cooking time. Well, these guys studied astronomy. They had 22 zodiacs, and 22 calendars, the Maya. They were highly sophisticated. And these people may have been descendants of the old Atlanteans of old. They're preparing the dish that we call history. And they know when the closing dates are coming. So you can call it a prediction if you like. But when it comes to predictions, there's many of them, down through the centuries. The message of the dissolution and the atrophy has been long. Here from the Puranas, which themselves are, you can't even date the Puranas, they're so many thousands of years old. The Purana says, there will be contemporary monarchs reigning over the earth, kings of curlish spirit, violent temper, and ever addicted to falsehood and wickedness. They will inflict death on women, children, and cows. They will seize upon the property of their subjects and be intent upon the wives of others. They will be of unlimited power, and their lives will be short, but their desires insatiable. People of various countries intermingling with them will follow their example. Wealth and piety will decrease until the world will be wholly depraved. Property alone will confer rank. Wealth will be the only source of devotion. Passion will be the sole bond of union between the sexes. Falsehood will be the only means of success and litigation, and women will be objects merely of sensual gratification. External types will be the only distinction of the several orders of life. A man, if rich, will be reputed pure. Dishonesty will be the universal means of subsistence. Weakness, the cause of dependence. Menace and presumption will be substituted for learning. Liberality will be devotion. Mutual assent will be marriage. Fine clothes will be dignity. He who is the strongest will reign. The people unable to bear the burden of heavy taxes, I guess they had their problems too, huh? They had IRS back then, will take refuge amongst the valleys. Thus in the Kali age, will decay constantly proceed, and the human race approaches its annihilation. Hermes Trismegistus, from 150 AD. So the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches by main force into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. The pious will be deemed insane, and the impious wise. The madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. In the 1600s, 17th century, Pastor Bartholomeus, the mystic, says, a great change will come to pass, such as no mortal man will have expected. Heaven and hell will confront each other in this struggle. Old states will perish, and light and darkness will be pitted against each other with swords. But it will be with swords of a different fashion. With these swords, it will be possible to cut up the skies and to split the earth. A great lament will come over all mankind, and only a small batch will survive the tempest, the pestilence, and the horror. From the Norse Edda of the Teutonic people, an incredible tradition stretching back to the dawn of time, The high priestess, the druidess, says in a prediction, she said, "Then saw she wade in heavy streams men, foul murderers and perjurers, and them whose others' wives seduce to sin. Brothers to slay brothers, sisters, children shed each other's blood. Hard is the world. Sensual sin grows huge. These are the sword ages, the axe ages. Shields are cleft in twain. Storm ages, murder ages, till the world falls dead." And then from the Celts, and this is from 5,000 years BC, after a great battle between the forces of light and darkness in Ireland, at a very famous mountain in Northern Ireland. They were standing there addressing the conquerors. But in the middle of the festivities, the queen, the high druidess, stood up and said, but we better realize that our glories and our age, in fact, is short, because we are to be followed by something awful that comes later. And the prediction was written down by the monks, and it's verbatim. She said, she added a prophecy in which she foretold the approaching end of the divine age and the coming of a new one in which the summers would be flowerless, the cows milkless, and the women shameless, and the men strengthless, in which there would be trees without fruit and seas without fish, when old men would give false judgments and legislators would make unjust laws, when warriors would betray one another and men would be thieves, and there would be no more virtue in the world. Look outside the window. She was right. Now, whether these guys are tracking the zodiac, the whole divination, the stuff that I study and teach, maybe that's how they understood this, or maybe there's clairvoyance, it really doesn't matter. The point being, these people knew that something was coming. They were obedient to the cycles of time. They studied nature and understood that if you have a summer, it will be followed by a winter. That there are winter cycles that not only consciousness goes through, but also that nature goes through, and time. Even in the Bible, we find hints of this dissolution and the ending of the ages. Broken down is the city of chaos, says Isaiah. Every house is shut up so that no one can enter. In the streets, there is an outcry. All joy has reached its eventide. All mirth of the world is gone. Desolation is left in the city, and its gates are battered in ruins. You think they're just talking about physical buildings? Don't these people who wrote this know that civilizations come and go? They're talking about some other kind of house that's battered to ruins. The house of the brain, the house of consciousness. Now, what we want to look at is this question that I go to very much in the Atlantis book, which deals not only with the origins of evil, but with the origins of the ego itself. Our waking consciousness, the thing we use every day when we wake up. In the book, we read about the deep and intense emotional and psychological trauma experienced by the survivors of the genetic interference, the flood, and the later pole shift. And we can argue amongst ourselves forever of which of those was the more traumatic. I think it was the first one, but boy, oh boy, the rest are pretty bad as well. And I contend that the ego of man, the center of his waking consciousness, may be of recent origins, coming about as an artificial center of consciousness due to this horrific trauma. The ego is a reaction to offset total and rapid psychic breakdown, the effects of which are still being felt. But because its birth was traumatic, its nature and behavior is necessarily vexatious, problematic, narcissistic, and violent. And the history of man is the record of ego existence. The ego is the one writing its own memoirs, which we call history. Now, when the ego wanes in power, history ends, meaning that if the ego in fact was born 13,500 years ago to replace the consciousness which was massively traumatized, then it also rises to its peak and comes to a wane. Now, what am I talking about before that? Before that, we had holarchic thinking. We were directly plugged into the matrix. We used the whole brain. But when you're having visitors come here and mess with your DNA, and that's followed by worldwide deluge and worldwide polar shift, the horrendous trauma of that basically destroyed the kind of consciousness that we had at that time, and it fractured. And just in the same way that when you're about to hit a vehicle in your car, or you're about to fall because you've slipped on the ice, a muscle becomes spastic. In order to what? To prop you up so that you don't completely fall. So in consciousness, there was this reaction. You have to think of consciousness or the ego in this term. It's not a very good metaphor, but it'll do. In order to offset total collapse, the ego was born. And you see this story actually in the first two cards of the major arcana of the tarot. The fool and the magician are the two aspects of this ego that came in. And see, the ego is very proud. Now that it did save us, it's one who wants to walk around in flowing robes. It's going, give me complete obedience. Hey, I saved your ass. The ego has done a great deal of job, a great deal of work. Now it's the center of consciousness, so to speak. And it's very limited. It's like a sort of an officious office manager. Well, of course it's going to be like that. The executives are out to lunch. The spirit is not with us. So who's running the corporation?